Okay, Jen, it's 3:02. Why don't we get started?
Great. Well, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm extremely excited to welcome you to our final event of our 2021 Peace Raiser, Piece by Piece, celebrating 10 years of New York Peace Institute. For those who don't know me, I'm Jennifer Megida. I'm the proud CEO of this wonderful organization. New York Peace Institute has been providing conflict resolution services in New York City for over 40 years in the form of mediation, conflict coaching, restorative justice, well-known trainings, organizational conflict consulting, and so much more. This year, we're celebrating, among other things, our 10th anniversary as an independent nonprofit organization. And we're so thrilled that you've joined us for this last event of a month-long celebration to honor the amazing work of our staff, volunteers, partners, mediators, and most importantly, the communities that we serve. As you all know well, the last 15 months have been challenging for so many. And our Peace Raiser has been focused on providing interesting dialogue and conversation about issues that are impacting all of us. The current economic situation, the racial tension and unrest, of course, COVID, police and civilian interactions, the political climate, and the important need for alternatives to incarceration and providing space for healing and restoration. In addition, these Peace Raiser events are focused on bringing together community, engaging with each other, and significantly for New York Peace Institute, generating revenue and support so we can continue to provide our services free of charge for so many years to come. I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming three extremely talented individuals who have generously agreed to participate in today's discussion about conflict and comedy. First, I want to welcome Paul Feig, an extremely successful filmmaker, writer, producer, and author whose films have grossed over $1 billion worldwide. Paul's directorial credits include the well-known feature films Ghostbusters, Spy, Bridesmaids, and The Heat, and he has also directed television episodes of Nurse Jackie, Weeds, Arrested Development, and Freaks and Geeks, which he also created. Paul is a legend, and we're so thrilled he could join us all the way from Belfast, where he's currently working on an upcoming project.
Thanks, Jen, and hello, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. Our second guest is Aparna Nancherla, who was designated in 2016 as ELLE's Women in Comedy issue as one of the most exciting new voices to hit the comedy scene. She can be seen in Comedy Central's Corporate, HBO's Crashing, and Netflix The Stand-Ups, and is also featured in Netflix Master of None, HBO's High Maintenance, Comedy Central's Inside Amy Schumer, and Hulu's I Love You, America with Sarah Silverman. She is the voice of Mina on Mira, Royal Detective, Hollycock, and BoJack Horseman, and Moon on the Great North. Aparna headlines throughout the world, and coincidentally, in 2018, she made her feature debut in Paul Feig's movie, A Simple Favor.
Everyone.
And our third guest this evening, or actually this afternoon, sorry, is Maz Jobrani, who's an actor, comedian, and author. As an actor, he was most recently seen on the CBS comedy Superior Donuts and has many appearances on television's most popular shows, including Grey's Anatomy, Curb Your Enthusiasm, and Better Off Ted. Maz starred in films including Jimmy Westwood, American Hero, Sidney Pollack's The Interpreter, and Disney's Descendants. And his stand-up comedy specials include Immigrant, which was filmed at the prestigious Kennedy Center and is a Netflix original, and has an LA Times best-selling book, I'm Not a Terrorist, but I've Played One on TV, which was published by Simon & Schuster. So thank you, Maz, also for joining us.
Hi.
And finally, I want to introduce Ayana Baheen, who's New York Peace Institute's Manager of Training and Business Development. Ayana adeptly moderated last year's Comedy and Conflict panel, which was a great success, and we are thrilled to welcome her back to continue our conversation with Paul, Aparna, and Maz. So without further ado, I want to express my gratitude to all of you, and I will now turn it over to Ayana.
Thanks, Jen. No pressure. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation about comedy and conflict. We're hoping this is going to be just a fun conversation, fun and informative, where we talk a little bit about how comedy influences conflict, or how conflict influences comedy, and kind of look at the ways that the two intersect. And we're really excited to have the three of you here to give us your insights and share with us your experiences and kind of how conflict kind of influences the comedy that you do. So I guess also audience members, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will get to them at the end. I've got a few questions that I'm going to ask first, and I'm looking forward to jumping right in. So Aparna, we're going to start with you.
Okay.
And we're going to ask this question. Okay. So we're here to talk about comedy and conflict. Let's talk about the ways that you use humor to talk about difficult or polarizing issues.
Yeah, well, I should start by saying I'm a pretty conflict averse person. So I kind of go out of my way to avoid conflict whenever I can. But also the nice thing about humor is it's a deflective coping mechanism, as I've learned in therapy. So it's sometimes a way to get around, the thornier parts of difficult topics, or like the parts that are going to make people tense up immediately. The nice thing about a joke is you can kind of use it to smooth over that entrance into the topic, and then people are laughing and they don't realize that now they're laughing about depression.
Right. So it's kind of like a way into a tough conversation instead of meeting it head on. Gotcha.
Yeah, and I think it's also a way for people to kind of bond over something, because when you're laughing together, you're not as uncomfortable, or you're not, immediately on guard about what's being said or how you're being depicted.
Right. It's hard to be angry when you're laughing.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's possible. It's possible.
It is possible. Maz, how about you?
Yeah, I think, I heard D.L. Hughley say one time, I was on a panel with him. I do a lot of panels. And big on the panel circuit. You should see me. I was on a panel with D.L. Hughley, and he said something along the lines of comedy is giving people their medicine, but in orange juice so they don't taste it. And I would say that I definitely, being Iranian American, especially after September 11th, even before September 11th, I leaned into that a lot, and I would talk about some of the things that I would see that were hypocrisies with the government and what was happening, like going to war with Iraq when there was no actual reason to, but they were creating these reasons. And it's interesting to me because back then, once in a while, I would get pushback. I'd be on stage. I remember being on stage at the Comedy Store in Los Angeles, doing some joke about George Bush, and there was some people in the audience and said, "You can't make fun of our commander-in-chief during a time of war." And I said, well, that's supposedly the reason we're going to Iraq is to bring democracy to Iraq. And now you're saying I shouldn't be democratic in my own country? It didn't, make sense. And then similarly under Trump, it was that on steroids. There were so many shows where I'd be performing, doing kid jokes, they're laughing. And then I get to the Trump stuff. And I had people write me emails and yell during the shows even, but a few people wrote me emails saying, "We were really enjoying the show until you decided to make fun of our leader." One lady said, "He is our leader, and the same way that kids should listen to their parents or something like that, we should, listen to our leaders," or something like that. It was just cuckoo to me. And I think the whole point of comedy is to be subversive. I mean, I started trying to be funny when I was a kid in school. I couldn't help myself, but the teacher would say something and I'd say something, I'd get in trouble. So it's a subversive way of dealing with the injustice in the world or the inequalities or whatever you see. And so it's a great tool to do that with, and I love doing it, even though sometimes people get upset when I do it.
Yeah, like sometimes people kind of struggle to hear you in the moment, but maybe, those jokes or that different perspective kind of stays with them even after they've left the show. Appreciate that, Maz. And Paul, so you're not doing stand-up, but you do use humor in your work. And so I guess the same question to you. How do you use it to talk about complicated and polarizing subjects?
Yeah, well, I came from the world of stand-up in the '80s. I was a stand-up comedian, and so I learned a lot from that. But what the funny thing that happens with me is that so many people will say to me, "Oh, do you want to do a drama? Because you do comedy movies. Do you want to do a drama one of these days?" And I'm always like, "Well, honestly, all my movies are dramas. They're just told in a funny way because a comedy story is not inherently that funny. It
Mhm.
needs the stakes, And if you look at a movie like Bridesmaids, that's a very dramatic story about a friendship falling apart, a desperate woman trying to bring it back together. But we tell it in a funny way, and so for me, it's just about that's the way to communicate effectively and make people, Maz, like you said, it's the pill and the orange juice. They have a good time, and you can kind of get things in. If we get very polemic and kind of preaching, people will shut off. And it's almost a way to kind of like they don't realize they're getting it, and it's up to us, as far as like a filmmaker and a storyteller, to make sure that we don't then have the heavy-handed and now we do it. It's kind of like we skirt around it. I mean, my movies are much more about the human condition
Right.
versus like hitting a political thing. But again, it's a way to say things and to bring up topics. So I find it to be, I think comedy's the best way to do things, even though it's not just in service of being silly all the time.
Right, right. And it's a way to have kind of a serious conversation in a way where people are more receptive to it than they would be if, like you said, you're preaching to them or you're giving them their medicine in liquid form that tastes disgusting, right? Like
Yeah,
instead, give it to them in a way.
you just feel a wall go up when you start
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
just like talk at them and versus like, hey, let's have fun. And then, yeah, then they hopefully glean whatever they do. And if they don't, then at least, okay, no harm, no foul. We didn't shut them down.
Right, right. And Maz, you talked about kind of like the change in, the way people responded when they disagreed with you, in Bush days versus in Trump days. And I'm wondering if, the pandemic, like if you've noticed a change in just this past year in the way that people. I'm not going.
Oh.
Uh-oh.
All right. I'm going to ask everybody to mute, and then we'll take turns on muting. Sorry about that. All right, thanks. So the question that I'm asking is, given this past year of like challenges and hardship, either talk about, how people have changed in the way that they respond to you, or you can talk maybe a little bit about the changes that you've made and how you're communicating with people over the past year. And I'll start with you, Maz, and then we'll go back around.
Well, I would say people have started sounding a lot echoier this past year. It's really interesting. It's weird because you say things and then you just hear it again. And I don't know if you've experienced that at all, Ayana, but it's a really interesting. Or are those just voices in my head? I'm not quite sure. The point is, you got to unmute yourself. How many times have you had that with there's people that are still coming on Zoom a year later that don't know how to unmute. You're like, you got to unmute. They're like, where's the unmute? It's the lower left. Unmute yourself. Listen, couple of things have happened. First of all, and I'm sure Aparna doing stand-up, sometimes you run into this. You say things that you don't think are controversial, but then they are controversial. So like I did a video on Instagram trying to be funny about it, but also being serious, encouraging people to get vaccinated. And I was like, hey, I got the vaccine. And then I got into a whole bit about like, some people don't want to get the vaccine because they think they're going to get a chip put in them. And I go, who the hell do you think you are that the US government wants to put a chip in you and follow you around? Like, what are you doing on a Tuesday at 4? You're still on the couch, I went on and on. And by the way, like Aparna was saying, I was also at the end I was a little apologetic of the whole video. I was like, by the way, guys, I'm not a doctor. I'm a comedian. So talk to your doctors, but I just think you should get vaccinated. And there was a lot of like, oh, funny, like. But then there was a lot of people going, you should not be telling people what to do. And it's their choice. And like, they took it really seriously. So first of all, you say things that you don't think are controversial, but they end up being controversial. That's one thing I've noticed. The other thing I've noticed is there's a lot of comedians who are complaining about cancel culture. And my response to that is, I go, look, if there's certain words that you can't say any longer, because we're progressing, you have a choice. You could be Archie Bunker and push back and go, I'm going to keep using this word and that word and I'm going to do it. Or you can grow with the times. I have young kids. I have a 12-year-old son and a 10-year-old girl. And I'm learning things from them all the time. And I want to be relevant 10 years from now. I want to be relevant 20 years from now. I want to be relevant next month. So when I go to the clubs, I feel it out a little bit and I go, okay, I got to change my language a little bit and I got to change the way I approach certain things. So definitely, I think this past year has exponentially pushed us forward in that world. And I'm not as worried about cancel culture but as much as I think we need to just adapt and move with the progression of culture, but it's happening.
I'm 100% with you on that, Maz, because I think it was not to call anybody out, but like Todd Phillips was saying, like, well, I can't do comedy anymore because everybody's offended by that. And I'm always like, well, what do you want to say? And I find it tends to be a lot of like white guys who complain about it. And it's just like, why do you want to offend? Why can't you, adapt in that way? And I find it to be a very boring thing to hear people go on about because it just means they just don't, they want to be able to offend everybody else. And I find it very aggravating. So I'm 100% with you on that one.
Yeah, it's interesting because comedy both is used as a bridge to kind of get over conflict and bring people together, but it does feel like we're in a moment where it's almost caused its own conflict where people are like, I'm on this side or I'm on, I'm either cancel culture pro or like I'm against the PC police. But I think all of it, I think a lot of it gets flattened on social media where it turns into these binary arguments, whereas a lot of it should open up kind of larger discussions about like why certain things are triggering, or like I don't think it should end as like this joke offended me, don't ever say it again. I think it should open up a dialogue, ideally that's not happening on social media, where I have found people aren't the most reasonable to talk to. So I think I almost feel like comedy nowadays sometimes causes conflict, but that should be an opportunity to like actually talk about things versus being like, well, that person's a moron and I'm not gonna even deal with them ever.
I love the idea of conflict as an opportunity, right? It's what we talk about a lot at Peace Institute. It's an opportunity to learn more about yourself. It's an opportunity to learn more about somebody else. It's an opportunity to like broaden the discussion and not just cut it off. Love that. Maz, you were going to say something.
I was going to say, when people come to a comedy show or they go to a movie, some people, come in defensively. Oh, impress me, make me laugh. Oh, I don't like this movie. I never liked this movie before. I'm not going to like this next movie. I'm not a fan of this kind of comedy. Well, you're coming in wrong. Like, don't even come in. Like, go see a therapist and figure out what's causing you to be this. And then come in open-minded and come into this place ready and open to see and laugh, because I don't always agree with everything I see on a comedy stage. Mm-hmm. But if it's funny, it's funny. So there's been times where I've been like, oh no, this comic's going there, and then I'm like, ooh, that was funny. And I personally politically don't agree with it, but I go, that was funny. And I think that it's a chance to talk about, as Aparna was saying, people take sides real quickly. The recent conflict, Israel-Palestine, you couldn't say anything on social media without people jumping on you. And I was personally just looking at how some of my other comedian friends were handling it who were from those backgrounds. And my buddy Sammy Obeid, who's very funny, he put out this video where he was performing at the Comedy Store in front of a Jewish audience. He's Palestinian. And he just put this piece together that was really funny and very well done. And I don't care what side you're on. You need to look at that and go, oh, wow, that was funny. That was smart. Now, I might not agree with you, and let's have a conversation, as opposed to going, you shouldn't say that. You're not allowed to say that, and I'm going to shut you down. Like, that's, like Aparna was saying, let's open up a conversation. I think comedy has the ability to do that. And it's a good way to start peace conversations.
I agree, because I think comedy comes off as very participatory, whereas speech making and polemics kind of shut the other person down. And so that's what I always loved about comedy too, in that way, is that it's kind of big tent at the end of the day.
Yeah, like it's an invitation into the conversation, right? Either with you're laughing or you're, talking about it amongst yourselves or with your friends afterwards, after you see a show, after you watch a movie.
No.
You know what drives me crazy? What I think one of the problems, and there's no way to stop this, is the fact that everything gets labeled with a title. Cancel culture, woke, and it just becomes this thing where you go like, I'm for it or I'm against it, and it's such a broad thing. I mean, again, there's nothing more boring than hearing old white guys complain about woke culture, because it's a very easy thing to hide behind. And I wish there was some way we could stop that. But if we could just get people out of that like black and white thing, and again, I think that's what comedy does. You kind of you tense up, and Maz, like you're saying, and then suddenly it's like, oh, well, okay, there's a point. I don't know if I agree with it, but that was funny, and that's a very shrewd observation. And so I think it allows us to kind of get between the cracks and go like, all right, at least maybe we can kind of get you to think about something.
Right. And also to look at nuance, look at the conversation with some nuance, right? It takes it out of a box, because the thing about comedy is like, it shows you one thing and you have a certain expectation, and then it shows you a different way of looking at it. And that can kind of open you up to seeing other perspectives and other ways of looking at things. And Aparna, I know you were just about to say something, so I didn't want to cut you off.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say, one interesting thing as a stand-up is sometimes there are trigger words that are going to elicit a strong reaction in the audience, and you either have to kind of build up to enough of a payoff where they're willing to go with you there to whatever that uncomfortable place you took them, or you just have to find like a more interesting way into the subject, which I feel like is sometimes the complaint that older generation comics have, where they're not allowed to like say a certain word or joke about something in a certain way. But it's like, no, you just might have to find a more interesting take on this, or like find a way to kind of win the audience back that you maybe didn't have to before.
And I also wonder if part of comedy, whether it's a film or whether it's stand-up or whatever you're putting out there, it's a two-way conversation. So the audience, again, has to be open to, because I was just thinking to myself, wouldn't it be cool if the next time, if they ever sit down and try to do Palestinian-Israeli peace, or if there's ever Democrats and Republicans actually working together, wouldn't it be great if they sat through, let's say, 1 hour comedy show with a comedian from one side, comedian from the other side, but funny comedians from both sides, not just like, somebody who's just saying things that are, political and that's it, but actually like funny stuff. And then afterwards, they sat down and started the conversation by maybe breaking down some of the things that were said, and then go into the actual peace process. And I recall just recently I was at the Irvine Improv performing, and there's a section I do on, now Irvine, as you guys know, is pretty conservative. The audience was relatively mixed, and there was one guy in the front that he looked like he was really not, like he was starting to steam when I started talking about. So I was doing this joke about how I got a cold during the coronavirus. I said, I got a cold during the coronavirus. And I go, you can't get a cold during the coronavirus. I go, because everyone thinks you got the coronavirus. I go, getting a cold during the coronavirus is what it felt like being Muslim after September 11th. I said, everyone thought you're going to hijack the plane. And then I turned to the white guy in the audience. I go, it's what it felt. I said, white people, it's what it felt like being white after January 6th. And then I go into the whole thing of like, that's when I was watching. I was like, oh my God, they got terrorists too. And then I go, I'm sorry, patriots. That's what you call your terrorists, patriots. So I'm going in, and I see this guy, he's steaming. I could see like he's about to explode. And I'm sitting in my mind as I'm doing it, I'm like, oh my God, is he one of those election deniers / supportive of the insurrectionists? Like, I couldn't tell. And so my question becomes, I wonder if there is a ideological limit or an ideological block to where someone who's so entrenched in an ideology, they will not allow themselves to laugh at themselves. Because I know in other audiences, I have like talked about somebody and like their background and been like, oh, you guys do da 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 da, and they go, yeah, and then people come after the show, they'll come up and be like, why didn't you do any jokes about my people? You should have done. So those people are ready to laugh. Then there's this ideological side that's not ready to laugh. So comedy becomes a two-way. We need to have that audience that's open to it. Because as much as I might say, oh, wouldn't it be great if laughter could open up the the next peace process, one side might not want to laugh. And so you're stuck.
I mean, that makes me think of so many things, right? Comedy as like the mediator lubricant, right? Before you're going to a really serious, tough conversation, let's get everybody laughing together. But also the concept of like, can people be so entrenched, so fixed in their position that they cannot laugh at themselves and they cannot see differently? I think we're embarking on the moment when we're going to answer that question, right? I mean, it does feel like there are such strong political and other divides in our country that, how are we going to talk to people who have a different perspective?
Well, I think the stakes are just so high right now that everybody is entrenched, and to admit that you're going to laugh at something, it almost admits that you made a huge mistake. Or it's almost like if your parents bring you up in a religion, it's almost hard to go against it because you have to admit that your parents weren't smart. However you want to think about it. But here's one point that I really want to make is the concept of comedy has been very much perverted in the last 4 to 5 years by what everybody thinks now they're a provocateur. And I went through this when I was doing the Ghostbusters movie, which became this complete madness of just everybody getting upset. Even Donald Trump was against it. It was crazy. But when they were attacking Leslie Jones that one night, when they all went after her, and I was communicating with Leslie, and she was freaking out, and I was freaking out, and I would reach out to these people and just go, "What are you doing? Are you fucking crazy?" And they would all be, "Oh, see, that's why you don't have a sense of humor. You don't understand. I'm being funny." And this whole idea, look at Trump for 4 years. Every time he'd say something crazy, like, "Well, he was just joking." So this idea of like, it's just a joke, you don't get it, that's really ruined for those of us who are professionals in comedy, the idea that everyone's a provocateur, everybody thinks they're Jonathan Swift, and they're really just a shitty, somebody just trying to say terrible stuff.
Right. You're not a comedian, you're just mean.
Yeah.
I would say leave comedy to the professionals.
Leave comedy to the professionals, yeah. Aparna, and then I have another question that I want to ask.
Yeah, sorry. Just responding to the same idea. I mean, yeah, I fully agree with that. I just think it's like everyone has kind of weaponized what their idea of comedy is. Like you can hide behind this idea that you're being funny, but if you're just preaching to this one specific bubble, they're going to agree with you, just like the way the bully's friends are like laughing because they don't want the bully to turn against them. And that's not really comedy at that point. That's just like social behavior.
Yeah, and I'll just, before you ask your question, I'll piggyback on all that. It's interesting because as Paul's saying, it's become, the beauty of social media is it's democratized everything. So you don't need to be seen by the casting director to go on and do whatever. There's some really funny people. I'll stumble upon some Instagram stars because my kids would point me that way, or YouTube stars, really funny. And I'm going, wow, this is really funny. But then there's also, as Paul said, there's people who are trying to get across a thesis. They go, oh, Joe Biden's a bumbling idiot or whatever. And then they're just showing Joe Biden falling or whatever. And you're going, where's the punchline? There's no punchline. You just have a thesis. And because you're saying it with a title of comedian, we're supposed to think it's funny. It's not. You can be on the right and you can be on the left, but you need to have the punchlines and you need to have actual like objective comedy. I mean, you can't really do like John Oliver is a great example. Gets really serious and you're like, oh my God, that's a lot of serious stuff. But he takes that moment to get out of it and do the silliest self-deprecating joke in the middle of it. And you can't help but chuckle. And it's kind of like you're being refueled for the next 10-minute diatribe. So it's really an interesting world that we're living in. You're right. People just say, I'm a comedian, and then they don't have any jokes.
But that's a great point, that self-deprecation also helps. Sometimes, like if you're trying to get a point across, if you kind of take a jab at yourself, people are like, okay, well, if you're also subject to being, pilloried a little bit, then we can laugh at ourselves too.
Yeah, that's a huge point. Yeah, it's the difference between preaching and just trying to be funny and relate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is a real tool of bringing people together and relating. I want to ask a kind of related question that, this conversation about politics and like how comedy can be used to talk about politics or talk about uncomfortable things. And the other piece that I want to talk about on the flip side is, so these national conversations are happening about racial injustice, social injustice, about change. How is that change showing up in your industry, and kind of, do you see it? Do you see the change? Are you part of making that change? Tough question, I know.
I mean, I think steps are being taken. I think the tricky part is, like, for example, when the George Floyd, like the protests around his murder happened, I think there were a lot of kind of gut checks that companies did, and a lot of, like, black square Instagram posts. And then you kind of want to do a check-in like a year later or 5 years later to be like, okay, what steps have you taken? Like, there's the optics of it versus the actual action. And I think we need to focus more on the action than the optics, which is tricky when social media is just a lot about optics.
I love that distinction between being performative and being real, like making real change, and like kind of what comes first, and how do you hold yourself accountable, or the institutions that you're a part of.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about creating opportunity. I mean, in my business is about, making sure that we're, interviewing and hiring beyond our default set of the usual people that we always hire, and I think it applies to what Aparna is saying. It's just like, it's very easy to go, put up a, retweet something, but, are you walking the walk? Are you talking the talk? And so, it's up to everybody to be accountable. And then, I guess it's up, maybe it's up to us in comedy to sometimes in a friendly way go like, hey, are you doing all that you could do?
I would say also in the film and television world, from the time I started 22, 23 years ago, definitely a lot more diversity. Even before, last year's protests, it's great to see creators from backgrounds that are diverse. And you see that now showing up in film and television. And what's great is, opposed to what executives might have thought 10, 15 years ago, those creators coming in with diverse voices are being watched. Because like 10, 15 years ago, when you'd go to pitch to a network, they'd say, well, you don't have enough white people in there. And you're like, why do I need to have so many white people? Well, because middle America won't watch it. Well, they're watching it. I mean, people are watching it all over the place. So that right there. I remember I was touring back then, and I would always say, look, the comedy we're doing around the country is, people are laughing in the South, in the East, and the West. So, you're sitting in an office in Hollywood and going, well, if we don't have enough of, just, farm-looking people, white farm-looking people, it's not going to work. And I go, you're not out there. I'm out there. It's working. So it's nice to see that. And stand-up comedy, I think stand-up comedy has always been kind of ahead of everything, because stand-up comedy from the time I started has always been diverse. So, I mean, I think Aparna will say, and I agree with her, that it's been tougher for female comedians in the comedy clubs because they weren't, as welcomed. But you're seeing more and more. But when it comes to diversity in color, and backgrounds, from the time I started, it was always, there was Latinos and African Americans, and I was one of the first Middle Easterners that showed up. But that's a way in. Hollywood's not going to put you in, but the comedy club will put you up. So.
I mean, that's what's always been so great about comedy, stand-up comedy. It's sort of the soccer, the football of the performance sports, because again, it's just you and a mic, it's you and your voice. And that's what I've always loved about it, with making movies, is, you got to get people to give you money, and you have to get a crew and all this stuff. And I just think it's so pure, and it's still, to me, is the greatest art form, because it is one person standing there and holding an audience's attention. And that's what's been so great about the internet, like you said earlier. I mean, I have a show that we have on a network that's going to come out on a network, and we found our lead actress because she did these funny videos on Twitter, and so it's really democratized the talent getting out there, and it's created a meritocracy, which is why I think it's so frustrating to all the people who think they're hilarious, but at least, you know, the cream does rise to the top. And it's a great way just to go, like, everybody's voice, everybody's story can be told if you just get out there and put it out there, and it will get found, I think.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the performers who maybe still felt marginalized in comedy clubs or at stand-up shows, which I think is still something certain people experience in certain environments, they do have that opportunity to kind of have their own platform now with the internet and kind of make the content and talk to the audience, like the audience will kind of find them versus kind of just assuming whoever is coming in the comedy club is going to get your sense of humor.
It is really fascinating to see people kind of come out of the internet and come onto the bigger stage when you think it's got to be saturated, like they're going to be drowned out, and still, you know, you find people and you find all this talent there. Appreciate that. I know we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, even though I have a couple more. So maybe I'll ask one last question for me, and then we'll get into the Q&A. And it's really just, again, about, you know, the role that you find humor plays in actually bringing people together and bridging the divides that we're seeing.
Well, I can say quickly that when people ask me, like, what's your purpose as a comedian? Like, what do you think I say, number one is to make people laugh. So you want it to be funny. You know, whether it's a fart joke or it's a political joke, if people are laughing, I'm happy. Like, that's why I got into this. I didn't get into this to solve the world's peace problems. I got into this because I was a big fan of Eddie Murphy's. He made me laugh. And then I was like, oh, I want to be funny. That said, once I got into it, I started seeing guys, or studying guys a little bit more, like Richard Pryor and George Carlin and these guys who were saying things. And I love that kind of stuff. So, like, pretty much every night I'm watching Colbert's monologue just to kind of get my news in a funny way. And I think that, you know, there are times when people's minds might be opened a little bit when they see or hear you. So, like, when we did the Axis of Evil comedy tour in 2007, that came out on Comedy Central. This was when, you know, Al-Qaeda, Iraq War, all that stuff's going on. And we got emails from people saying, because it wasn't just us on stage, it was also the audience, happened to be a lot of Middle Easterners in the audience. So I always said, when they went to the audience and they were laughing, I think that was one of the first times you saw on American television Middle Eastern people laughing, and like in a good way. And so we got emails from people saying, hey, after September 11th, I hated all Muslims and I hated all Arabs or whatever. And thank you for this because it made me open my eyes. So we didn't do it with that purpose, but it had that effect. So if somebody comes to your show one time and let's say they have a hatred for fill in the blank, whatever that is, and somebody from that background goes on stage and makes that person laugh, it's like when you have an athlete from a background that you thought you hated, and then all of a sudden you're rooting for that athlete. So it does have the potential to open people's minds a little bit and present you in a different way that will hopefully go towards conflict resolution.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just, kind of jumping off what Maz said and going over a point we kind of made before, but I think just opening up the number of voices and experiences you're seeing that are telling their stories and making comedy about them sort of opens up people's minds about like what a certain person looks like. Like if you see a trans comedian, it might make you reconsider like what a trans person is like if you've never met one in your life. So I think that's also why it's so valuable that not every comedian is a straight white cis male, because then you're only getting that sliver of the human experience.
Yeah, and Maz, I think you hit the nail on the head, because I always face my career this way too, of like, our first job is to entertain people. And I always go through this thing of like how it's why I always have a hard time with like when celebrities or famous people get political or whatever. It's like, is that what the audience really wants out of us? But it's always when it becomes like, and now I'm going to hammer you with this stuff versus like, here's things that are important to me. How am I going to weave them in a way that my first goal is to entertain you? I think the minute you go, my first goal is to give you a message, it gets mushy, you know? And so again, it's the pill and the orange juice. Like, how do we do it? Even if that is our goal, like, you know, people shut down so fast in stand up, in entertainment and movies and TV. So, you know, I think if we go in with that goal, then at least we're ahead of the game.
Yeah, and it's storytelling, you know, from a movie, a film, a stand-up show, and in mediation and conflict resolution, it's about like three-dimensionalizing people that you are in a conflict with, or that you don't know, or that you're misjudging for some reason. Thank you for that.
I think that, can I piggyback on that? I think that's a great point, because you know, all the problems, you know, always are about people who just one-dimensionalize the other. And there is something so great about seeing somebody who is the other to you being funny and being relatable and all that. It's why it's so important. And that's why I always go like, oh, please don't go too far into not being funny. Be big tent, even though if you feel like you're softening your message, I think you're doing more because you're drawing people in and making yourself, I don't know, you're just changing their opinion of who you are, which is shitty that we have to do that, but whatever opens the door and gets them thinking and opening up, then that, you know, that's a good thing.
I mean, which is why there's like gotta be different people who are like coming at the same problem in different ways. Like you do it your way, Aparna does it her way, Maz does it his way. And like together, that's opening people's minds to, you know, possibilities and a different perspective than they would have had otherwise. All right, I'm gonna see if I can ask these questions that have come through the chat. One person asked, as a comedian, how do you play with the us versus them dynamic?
Us versus, I'm curious if they mean us versus them in terms of like people who don't believe the same things you do, or yeah, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because every audience is going to be a mishmash of different people. Like your audience could be a mix of us and them. So I think you have to find a way to kind of, you know, if you're going to take a bunch of jabs at them, then you're going to have to balance it out with us, or it's going to just feel like, again, a one-way conversation.
And also, I think you don't, like Paul was saying with the big tent, when you label somebody like a group, that becomes hard. So I've been on stage and I said, blah, 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 Republicans, da, 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 da. And then I could feel some people, I could feel them kind of turning off a little bit, because it's like, because there might be Republicans in that audience. And if you didn't say Republicans, blah, 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 but you said, you know, Republican Senator Jim Jordan, or if you said, you know, this person, specific person, or some people in Congress want you to, you know, it's presenting it in a way like now when I go into the Trump stuff, I mean, I don't do there's not that much Trump stuff left, but I just talk about like, I'm just happy the election's over and we're in this world now. And I start by saying, I don't care who you voted for. Like, I can still love you. And I go, just calm the F down. All right. Because I said for 4 years, every time I mentioned his name, people would start freaking out. Like I was making fun of their grandmother. Just relax. And then the other thing I do is I go further and I go, I had to deal with it because I say, my own mother, turns out, wanted to vote for Trump. And I didn't know until I encouraged her to vote. And then she said, I wanted to vote for Trump. And I was like, well, you know, you also have the right not to vote. So if you can personalize it, if you can not label, you could talk about the issue, but don't label, because once you label, whoever's from that side is going to really take it, I think, be offended by what you're saying, as opposed to being open to it.
I also think it's turning them into us, you know, and so that's why I think the more it's about the human condition and about we all go through this kind of, you know, it's not doing Seinfeld stuff, but it is in that world of like, hey, have you ever, you know, at least that people go like, oh yeah, we have the same issues, we have the same problems, which I think, you know, helps bring it all around.
Yeah, the funny thing to me is like we there is something I think that is addictive about keeping it as us versus them. Cause like as comedians or as a stand-up, sometimes you like go to a town, let's say you go to Syracuse, if you just open your set by being like, well, I was just in Buffalo and those guys are dumb, like you're gonna get the automatic laugh. So I think it's sometimes easy to fall back into the like, we're on the good side and everyone else is dumb. Like we have to kind of work to be better than that or bigger than that.
I feel like that's a running theme for you, Aparna, is like you have to work for the laugh.
Yeah.
Like don't take the easy laugh.
That's
Right?
what people say about me. They're like, you can see how hard she's working up there.
Well, you know, by the way, I mean, listen, if you're opening up, like you said, there's no harm in, it's almost like you're winking to it, right? It's like in that movie, in the Adam Sandler movie, when where he was a comedian and Seth Rogen was playing the young comic, and they go to do the corporate event, and Adam Sandler says the first thing you want to do is you want to cuss out MySpace because they were, you know, hired by Facebook or whatever it was. And then James Taylor goes on before and plays a song, and then he cusses out MySpace. He took Seth Rogen's joke. So it's okay, I think, and like in a nod and a wink. Like I did an event for 7-Eleven franchisees, which, by the way, I found a little racist that they were hiring like this Middle Eastern guy. But anyway, that was besides the point. I actually went up and like jokingly, I was like, "You guys are 7-Eleven." I was like, "Well, you know what? F Quickie Mart," you know. Obviously, I didn't mean it. Like I wasn't upset about Quickie Mart, but you know, they some of them might have been like, "Yeah, F Quickie Mart," or I think most of them understood that it's like a joke. But I think it's you know, if you're gonna do it in a fun, silly way, it's fine. You know, and if you go to places where there's always rivals. I just did shows in Dubai, and Dubai and Abu Dhabi are rivals, even though they're, you know, different Emirates and the United Arab Emirates. But, you know, when you're over there and you go, oh, Dubai, you know, and then someone goes Abu Dhabi, and then you go, oh, yeah, you guys are not as fun as the people in Dubai. And then they're like, yeah, we're so fun. That's okay. You know, it's more about like us versus them. You know, you don't, you know, if you're actually talking down about somebody, and you know, again, as somebody who's very liberal in my politics, if I'm on stage going like, you know, what the problem is with the Republicans, I'll tell you what the problem is with Republicans. There goes, you know, I don't know who's in my audience, but there goes 10, 15, 20, 30, maybe 50%. Maybe you're in some state or some city where there's a bunch of them. So there's a little bit of dance you got to do in the way you present it.
Yeah, it's an interesting balancing act and you all are, you know, amazing at it. I want to ask Hal Gessner's question, which is, before the Trump era, my friends and I used to hear and share a new, usually bad joke at least once a week. But over the last 4 years, that's dried up. Have you experienced this among your circles, and how has it affected your work? So, you know, is there a tension? Is there less camaraderie, a community? Has your community shifted and changed? And if so, how's that affected your work?
I think you definitely feel yourself going like, I wonder if what side they're on. And it's terrible that after all trying to be Big Tent, there is that thing of like, you know, especially depends what community you're hanging out in or what city you're living in. You're kind of like, okay, this is cool. And then suddenly you'll just blast in with something and somebody's like, shuts down, and you're like, oh my God. And then you start to have weird feelings about that. So it's such a landmine. And the people who you discover are on sides you wouldn't think they're on is really eye-opening. And it's made me much more cautious about just sort of, you know, blasting off at the mouth.
Yeah, it's true. Like a lot of comedians, and I'm not going to name names, but like that I started with, now people are like, oh, did you know so-and-so is alt-right now? And I'm just like, why? What an interesting choice to make. Like, it almost feels like there are certain people who, for lack of a better way to interpret it, go to a certain political stance just because they know it will attract them attention or like give them more of an audience. And that's also a strange thing to navigate, because you're like, do you actually believe these things, or are you just, have you now just become like a caricature of this because it, like, people will be like, yeah, you are great. There's the addiction of that attention in this moment, and the ego, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that no, it's funny. There's one comic who I used to work with a long time ago, and I said to him, I go, you really gotta work on finding your voice. Just get out there, do late night spots, find your voice. And then like when Black Lives Matter started happening, I saw him like posting stuff about like all lives matter and this and that. I was like, oh no, his voice is racist. I was like, you found your voice and it's the wrong voice.
Unfind your voice.
Unfind your voice. Lose your voice.
Yeah.
No, but I think, first of all, I lost friends during this. Like there was a lot of friends of mine that did not agree with me. And it wasn't just the race stuff. It was right off the bat with like, the pandemic hits and they're going, this isn't real. And here's a video talking about how Fauci it's a pandemic. And I mean, they started going QAnon and it was sad because I go, is he for real or is he doing this to just like, be provocative? And I think that what's happened is, I think Obama said, like, when we can't even agree on the facts, comedy, it helps if your facts are something we agree on. And it helps when, I mean, the definition of a fact is that it's something that happened, it's real, right? But when we have alternative facts, then, now you're going into this world of like, oh my God, I've seen comics do jokes that were based on, non-factual things. And I'm going, this guy needs to do his research before he goes out spouting this stuff, because he's getting the laughs, but what he's saying is a lot of bullshit. So yeah, I've lost friends to this past year, whether it was because of the coronavirus or the Black Lives Matter or the election. And it's sad that that's happened, but it's also eye-opening to go, oh wow, I've been friends with you all this time and this is how you thought about things. You know what? I'm kind of happy that I know that about you now, because some people go, I don't want to get into politics with friends because I don't want to lose friends. And I have a couple friends that are like that as well. But you know what? If you're really going to go to the extremes of emphasizing that all lives matter, and as I talk to you, I realize that you really like aren't on board with the movement of like of justice and all that other stuff. I mean, it's just because you could start going down, issues. You're like, all right, okay, so you're not into Black Lives. Okay, you're against Black Lives Matter. Okay, so what about abortion? Okay, you're against that. Okay, what about guns? Okay, you don't want gun control. Okay, what about whatever? Just go down these categories. You're like, oh, we don't really agree on anything, except for like the Yankees. So that's I'm just good. I'm good. You just no more play dates for our kids. I'm fine with that.
And it's weirdly been very challenging to be tolerant in the last 4 years. And, but us as comedian, people in comedy, that is our goal, is to kind of entertain everybody. I know, especially, in the world I'm in where, everything costs millions of dollars. So you're like, okay, let's not polarize anybody. But it's this, I don't know, there's times you just want to go like, let's just write those people off. But then it's like, is there some way to get through? But everybody's so dug in, it's like arguing with a fundamentalist from whatever they are fundamental about. And it's tough, and I grapple with it every day, because I'm an optimist. I don't want to give up on people, but you're kind of like, wow, this is getting really hard.
Yeah, and it's also, you wonder like how they came to those views, because I also think, I don't know, maybe if I watched 72 hours of YouTube videos about how the earth is flat, I would think the earth was flat, I'd be like, they made some good points.
Great point, Aparna. Last question, because we have 5 minutes left. This is the last question before I bring on Michael. So this question's from Michael Cassandra, and he says, are there topics that are so emotional or personal to any of you that you won't make a joke about it? This relates to mediation, as sometimes we mediators need to know ourselves really well when faced with parties who might be going through something we've gone through and can't be impartial about.
Really, for me, I just try to either do self-deprecating stuff, or I try to punch up. Politicians are all fair game, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter. But people who have, let's say, I've always felt awkward when I see a comedian making fun of someone with a disability or any kind of mental illness, like that kind of stuff is just uncomfortable to me. I'm going, what are you doing? So that's that. But if you have, let's say you're dealing with some sort of conflict is different. Obviously, conflict is not making fun of somebody with a handicap, but if you're in a room and you're starting off a peace negotiation, again, for lack of a better example, Israelis and Palestinians, if you have a joke that kind of, can deflate the tension a little bit, that might be, again, something like, my dad used to say, or my mom used to say, when I first told my mom I wanted to be a peace negotiator for the Israelis and Palestinians, they said, oh, no, or whatever that is, or they said, like, you can't even make peace with your brother. You're going to go make peace with the Palestinians, or whatever that is. If there's a joke like that, it's like, you're not saying either one of you are bad. You're not saying, you're making it again. I think those types of things, if you have something like that, it's a great icebreaker. Get it started, sure, but don't call me if it doesn't work.
Yeah, I think it's what Paul was saying earlier. Like, if you kind of agree that we all experience the human condition and life is hard in many ways for anyone who exists on this planet, then that is like a starting point of where to go from, where it's like, aside from all your beliefs, like we all, wake up in the morning and we all have families and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and for me, it's kind of from a storytelling point of view with this stuff is there's just certain topics I just don't like to see portrayed, but it's just what I can bring to something. Like, I don't like stories about adultery because I find this is really depressing, so I always, in our companies, like, I don't bring me any of those. But yeah, I think it's kind of what you think you have a take on, and if you've got an interesting take or a big tent take on it, that's fine. If you don't, I think it's better not to step into it unless you really want to soul search and find, through your own self therapy, find the germ of what bothers you about it, and then find a way to kind of bring it to people in a way that is, kind of open for discussion and trying to figure out with them.
And one other thing I wanted to say about stand-up is, like, it's kind of an evolving dialogue with the audience. Like, there are jokes I made when I started that I don't agree with now. So I think you're allowed to evolve as a human. It's like what you say in 2002 might not be how you feel now. Like, we're not necessarily politicians in that sense of, like, you voted for this act, so why are you now saying this?
Right.
And
We're not
you're-
static.
Oh, sorry, and you're always just in a constant thing to try to find your voice, and that's a very sensitive time in your career.
I feel like, I could keep going, and you all have been so insightful and so generous with your experience and your perspective. So thank you so much. I'm going to ask Michael Williams, our board chair, to join. Hi, Michael.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aparna, Maz, Paul, and Ayana. That was an amazingly rich and interesting discussion. I just wanted to make sure everyone knows that this is our final Peace Raiser event. And so we'd like to announce our final push to reach a goal of $40,000 in honor of New York Peace Institute's more than 40 years of service in New York. This fundraiser is necessary to support the conflict resolution services we provide to our communities free of charge. We're pleased to announce that a group of us board members will be matching any donations you make up to $5,000 as of today, June 4th, and that means your donations will effectively be doubled. We appreciate any donations to support and expand our work. You can donate through our website or through our Peace Raiser 2021 page, which will be linked to in our chat. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you all for being there and for supporting New York Peace Institute. We appreciate you. And again, thank you to our guests and panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.